Welcome back to Judgment and Decision Making. I'm Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to talk about moral dilemmas, including the trolley problem. There's this basic question of, do the ends justify the means? And this is illustrated very nicely in the classic trolley problem.
A runaway train is heading towards 5 workers on a railway line. There's no way of warning them, but you're standing near a lever that operates some points. Switch the points, and the train goes down a spur. Trouble is, there's another worker on that bit of track too, but it's 1 fatality instead of 5. Should you do that? Many people think the right thing to do would be to switch the points, to sacrifice 1 to save 5, since that produces the best outcome possible. Now imagine the train heading for the workers again. This time it can only be stopped by pushing a very large man off a bridge. His great bulk would stop the train, but he'd die. Should you do that? Most people say no. But why not? Both thought experiments are cases of sacrificing 1 to save 5. What the trolley problem examines is whether moral decisions are simply about outcomes or about the manner in which you achieve them. Some utilitarians argue that the 2 cases are not importantly different from each other. Both have similar consequences, and consequences are all that really matter. In each case, 1 person dies and 5 are saved, the best option in each harrowing situation. But lots of people say they would switch the points, but they wouldn't push the man off the bridge.
As noted from the video, there's 2 scenarios in the general version of the trolley problem. You can pull a lever that will divert the trolley into a different track where it will hit and kill a person. Or you have scenario 2, where you push a person onto the track to stop the trolley. Now, before we move on, I want you to guess about which brain regions are associated with scenario 1 and scenario 2. I know it's not the focus of this course, but by now you might be intuitively picking up on the different brain regions that are associated with these 2 different types of scenarios. To start, scenario 2 involves the amygdala, which we've talked a lot about, and the VMPFC. These are all emotional areas in the brain. And scenario 1 involves the DLPFC, which is the emotional regulation and kind of the cognitive control component of the mind. And about 30% of people would go with scenario 2, and the vast majority of people would go with scenario 1. And we can understand why. The emotional response elicited by the second scenario, as illustrated by the brain regions that are activated, really gives a negative emotional response to that circumstance. Whereas scenario 1 is a little bit removed. You're sort of making an analytical judgment, and it doesn't evoke such strong emotional reactions to that event. And the real difference here is intentionality. 5 people are saved because the trolley has been diverted to another track. The killing of the individual is a side effect, and the 5 would still be saved if that individual wasn't on the track. Whereas in scenario 2, 5 people are saved because a person is killed. So it's a different type of intentionality that seems to be part of the difference between these 2 scenarios that are very similar. Let's look at another situation. In the process of lunging for the switch, you must push a person out of the way who falls to the ground and dies. So this is very similar setup where you have to physically push a person and that person does die in order for you to pull the switch. What do? We would predict that about 30% of people would be willing to do this because it's the same outcome and the same action as the version where you push someone onto a track. You're still pushing someone and someone dies. But in fact, only 70% of people do indeed opt for this outcome. The same pushing, same proximity, but done unintentionally as a side effect. So you are not intending to hurt someone, it's a side effect, even though they do die. Let's look at one more scenario. In this scenario, the track is on a loop, and you do pull the lever, but somewhere down the track, there's an individual who happens to be on the track, and the train hits that person and stops and saves the 5 people. Well, do you choose to go with this option? There is an intentionality to this scenario, the same as pushing someone. So you know that you are going to kill someone. It's equivalent to pushing them on the track. So with that said, we would predict that there would only be 30% of people would be interested in the scenario. Instead, we find 60 to 70% would be willing to take this scenario. And what is really the difference here? The difference is that the action happens in the future and it's displaced from you. Now, killing someone intentionally as a means of saving 5 people feels intuitively wrong, but the intuition is strongest when the killing occurs right here, right now. If it's displaced into the future and further away from you, it doesn't feel as strong. It doesn't feel as bad to have that event happen, even though, of course, it's the same amount of people dying. Intuition discounts heavily over space and time. And I think this makes a lot of sense based on how we are responding to things like climate change and COVID-19 response. Both of those two situations involve us taking actions right now, small actions, that have long-term impacts much further down the road. And those types of actions are very hard for us to do because the repercussions of our actions are so far displaced in time. And the emotional salience of the bad events aren't happening now. So it's harder for us to take actions now. But we know in class that it is important when you're presented with these scenarios to activate type 2 processing and recognize that the actions that you take today, you need to be taken immediately in order to mitigate the long-term impact. Now let's talk a little bit about cultural context. Do the ends justify the means, and how do different cultures think about this? Now, there's 2 different categorizations of cultures that the book discusses. One is the collectivist cultures, which are generally East Asian societies, and the other one is individualistic cultures, generally Western Europeans and North Americans. And the collective cultures are generally more comfortable than individual ones with people being used as a means to a utilitarian end. Moral imperatives in collectivist cultures tend to be about social roles and duties to a group, whereas those in individualistic cultures are typically about individual rights. The way that these 2 categorizations of cultures, they vary specifically on do the ends justify the means. Let's look at one more, how moral behavior is enforced. In collectivist cultures, it's generally enforced with shame, which is an external judgment on an individual by a group, and it's associated with honor. Did you bring or did you discount honor to the entire group? Whereas an individualist culture, it's associated with guilt, which is the internal judgment on yourself. Do you feel bad about your actions? And that's how this moral behavior is enforced. Those 2 different framings of fairly similar sensations, but they come from different forces. All right, summary here. People make different moral judgments about the same circumstance, depending on whether it's about themselves or someone else, how many steps are in the process, and how far removed they are from that process, both in space and time. The level of stress hormone that they have. If they're highly stressed, they're going to make more impulsive type 1 decisions. The fullness of their stomach and other environmental factors. The smelliness of their environment, and the culture that they're in. And these are just a small subset of the many different examples illustrated in this book. So that's to say that moral judgments are highly influenced by many, many, many factors in the environment and within our biology.